Real reason why US is silent on Bangladesh chaos, attacks on Hindus. There have been hundreds of attacks against Hindus, the biggest minority group in Muslim-majority Bangladesh, since the fall of the Sheikh Hasina government. The country is in a state of chaos. However, the silence of the US, which presents itself as the champion of human rights, is deafening. What's behind this strategic silence? Article by Yudhajit Shankar. This silence is deafening. The US, the tutor of rights and democracy across the world, has been completely mum on the attacks on minorities in Bangladesh. The latest display of this gag was the dropping of the mention of Bangladesh and atrocities against Hindus from the readout on the Modi-Biden talks. Why is the US avoiding being critical of the situation in Bangladesh under the military-backed caretaker government led by Muhammad Yunus? Experts see India and the US, two strategic allies, not being on the same page on Bangladesh, and suggest that India needs to keep that in mind going ahead. In fact, when it comes to India's interests in Bangladesh, the US has been in the opposite camp. It tried to prevent the liberation of Bangladesh from Pakistan in 1971 and then sided with political parties that were pro-Pakistan. It has always backed the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, BNP, during whose rule anti-India forces found Bangladesh a safe haven. The US worked over the years to undermine the Awami League rule under Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. The US sought to prevent the birth of Bangladesh. But even today, it is not on the same page with India regarding Bangladesh. It has welcomed the recent regime change there and been silent on ongoing human rights abuses, including attacks on minorities, arbitrary arrests, forced resignations, and physical assaults on political detainees, says geostrategist Brahma Chelani. On August 26, American President Joe Biden called up Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who had returned from a visit to war-torn Ukraine. The crisis in Ukraine and Bangladesh were among the issues discussed by them. The Indian readout mentioned that PM Modi and Biden expressed their shared concern over the situation in Bangladesh, but the White House readout was mum on the issue and focused only on the Ukraine-Russia war. They, PM Modi and Biden, emphasized the restoration of law and order and ensuring safety and security of the minorities, particularly Hindus, in Bangladesh, according to the statement by India's Ministry of External Affairs on the Modi-Biden talks. Though countries often highlight issues that are important to them, experts have noticed the strategic silence of the US on the post-Hasina chaos in Bangladesh. When Biden called Modi last evening, they discussed Bangladesh and shared concerns about the situation there, as the Indian readout pointed out. But the White House readout, tellingly, does not disclose the Bangladesh-related discussion, says Chelani. The days of anarchy following Sheikh Hasina fleeing Bangladesh saw hundreds of targeted attacks on minorities, especially Hindus. PM Modi, while congratulating Yunus for taking over as the head of the caretaker government, spoke about ensuring the safety of Hindus in Bangladesh. Yunus himself has admitted to the targeting of minorities and visited Dhaka's historic Dakeshwari temple to reassure the country's Hindu community. Indicating that the law and order situation in Bangladesh is far from normal, students have fought pitched battles with members of Bangladesh Ansar Baini, a paramilitary force, and forced dozens of officials and teachers to resign. How the US systematically weakened Sheikh Hasina. What could be the reason for the US's silence on the crisis in Bangladesh and the attacks on Hindus there? For one, it has pounced on every opportunity to point fingers at India over rights. The US systematically weakened Sheikh Hasina over the last decade, says Shafqat Rabi, a Bangladeshi-American political analyst and faculty member at Dallas University. US official statements, reports from US-domiciled Human Rights Watch, HRW, Amnesty International, and various US-aligned media and NGOs around the world gradually downgraded Hasina from a role model of female empowerment to one of the world's rare female despots, Rabi tells India Today. This U.S. effort gradually reduced Hasina's overseas footprint and allies. Europe, for example, was more tolerant of Hasina's excesses earlier on due to her secular credentials, but that was made unsustainable due to U.S. activism, explains Rabi. Rabi, who has an extensive network in Bangladesh, says the U.S. Embassy in Dhaka regularly held sessions with the civil society, diaspora opinion makers, social media influencers, to keep hopes for a democratic rejuvenation alive. Once Hasina constrained all her domestic political opponents, keeping the desire for democracy alive via such engagement was the long-term strategy U.S. utilized to systematically weaken Hasina's standing in Bangladeshi society and abroad, adds Rabi. The most debilitating blow to Hasina were the U.S. sanctions on the Rapid Action Battalion, RAB, in 2021. The sanctions crippled the deadly force and enthused Hasina's critics. The U.S. put Hasina's most potent tool for oppression, the RAB, under sanctions, which emboldened the civil society in Bangladesh. Statistically speaking, extrajudicial killings and disappearances went down significantly after those sanctions. After all, it was coercion that sustained Hasina's regime, and towards the end she needed even more of that, which was already blunted by U.S. activism, says Rabi. Hasina became the dictator that she began her political career fighting against. People were suffocated, and the anti-quota protests of 2024 became the outlet of the massive outpouring of popular anger against her. Obviously, Hasina's own continuous misdeeds only amplified the success of the fairly inexpensive American approaches, adds Rabi. By weakening Hasina, the U.S. might have been creating ground for a favorable government at the right time. It should also be remembered that Muhammad Yunus was viewed as part of the 111 depoliticization process, which is seen to be an American plan for regime change in Bangladesh. 111 refers to the process initiated on January 11, 2007, by which a military-backed caretaker government assumed charge in Bangladesh on the eve of the general election. For 2 years, it tried to work on what is referred to as the -2 formula to get rid of the top two political players, Sheikh Hasina and Khalida Zia of the BNP. After the violent nationwide protests, it is Yunus who is at the helm of the caretaker government. The wife of a high-ranking advisor to the caretaker government also works with the U.S. Embassy in Dhaka. Why U.S. isn't ready to acknowledge the post-Hasina chaos? Shafqat Rabi explains how several people from the American network made it to the caretaker government in Bangladesh. Hasina effectively silenced and brought into her patronage network the entire civil society, the media, and bureaucrats, except for only a few who are independent and are still vocal. When the students toppled her government, there were not very many known people with the acceptability to even face the students in person, let alone be proposed by them for an advisor's job, says Rabi. The 15-year-long authoritarian rule silenced most of Hasina's credible critics. Therefore, the names that were left and acceptable to the student revolutionaries had an outsized representation from outside the Hasina patronage network that the Americans dominated, he adds. After having worked to undermine the Hasina administration and seeing a government that has people aligned to its interests, the U.S. would think twice before being critical of the new setup in Bangladesh. The Biden administration was on August 12 questioned as to what steps it was taking to stop the atrocities against Hindus in Bangladesh, given that 2 Democrat lawmakers had written to President Biden on the issue. Neither did this elicit strong condemnation from the U.S., nor a promise to act. Look, we're going to certainly continue to monitor the situation. I don't have anything else to say beyond that, but when it comes to any type of human rights issues here, the president has always been very consistent in speaking loud and clear in public and also privately, and he'll continue to do that, said White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre. It is obvious that having spoken and worked against the Awami League government, the U.S. would not readily admit to the post-Hasina crisis in Bangladesh. Be it Afghanistan or Iraq, the U.S. has, throughout the 20th century, tried to establish democracy and left those countries in a shambles. Even the 2018 anti-quota agitation against then Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina is seen to have had an American imprint. Nurul Haq Nur came out of nowhere to become the vice president of Dhaka University Central Students' Union, DUCSU, despite the Awami League students' organization, the Chhatra League, dominating campus politics. Nur played a key role in the 2018 quote reforms agitation, which forced the Hasina government to withdraw the reservation in government jobs. Nur was close to American embassy officials in Dhaka and was believed to have been propped up by the U.S., a former Indian diplomat to Bangladesh told India Today. U.S. interests do not align with India's in South Asia. Being next door, Bangladesh is very important for India strategically and for security reasons. Any disturbance there is going to impact India, whereas the U.S., located 13,000 kilometers away, is immune to any crisis in Dhaka. Bangladesh is one among the countries where India and the US aren't on the same page. Shared interests in the Indo-Pacific or US support for Indian engagement with Ukraine cannot obscure the fact that, in India's own neighborhood extending from Myanmar to the Pakistan-Afghanistan belt, American interests do not align with core Indian interests, says expert Chelani. Security expert Farron Jeffrey says Bangladesh remained in the Indian sphere for all these years because Pakistan alone wasn't capable of overturning the situation. But everything changed the moment Uncle Sam casually walked into the picture, he says. Jeffrey says we shouldn't underestimate the importance of U.S. interests in the region and not overestimate its own position. India needs to be careful going ahead, warns expert. How the U.S. is capable of engineering changes in India's neighborhood has already been talked about. U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Donald Lu visited Dhaka in mid-May and met politicians and civil society leaders. It was in June that Bangladesh was in the throes of unprecedented protests against the ruling party. It was the same Lu who was blamed by Imran Khan for trying to topple his government. "We got a message from America." "Oh, not America, I mean a foreign country I can't name," Khan said in a live televised address in March 2022. Reports also named Donald Lu as the person who influenced the internal politics in Nepal and Sri Lanka. What is also being talked about is how a CNN correspondent has fed the narrative of India being behind the recent floods in Bangladesh. The Indian government has already trashed those allegations with hard facts. India hopes to be a superpower, but India doesn't even have an equivalent of CNN. The moment the CNN crew landed in Bangladesh, the Indian narrative was in trouble, says Jeffrey, the head of international think tank ITCD. The security expert warns that India would be in a difficult situation, both internally and externally, if the U.S. decides to treat it as a non-aligned transactional partner instead of a reliable strategic ally. Bangladesh is the biggest reality check for India. But there could be more reality checks down the road. India should tread carefully, he warns. While the role of the U.S. in the regime change in Bangladesh, like in other countries of the region, is very shady, there are enough hints of how it acted. Against this backdrop, it isn't difficult to understand why the U.S. is mum on the post-Hasina chaos in Bangladesh and the attacks on Hindus there.